This week I made some cute little vessels and I took some video for you. So first of all, I'm going to prep my tube, and I'm starting with the cut blow tube here. I'm going to flare out the end. When I connect this to the larger piece of colored tubing, I'm going to condense it, and starting with it flared out means that it won't get too narrow when I melt them together and kind of condense and pull out. And I need 2 of them because I'm breaking down a pretty big chunk and I'm gonna tear it up. So I just get the end of that hot, and then I use my graphite tool to flare out the end. I did edit out me scampering off to get more clear rod. These come in really long lengths, and you can score and cut them, but I'm choosing to flame cut them. I think it's just cleaner, makes a nicer edge. And that way it's like preheated, so it's not gonna snap and break when I'm ready to use it. Now that looks like a clear rod, but it's actually grease stain from greasy glass, and I just melted off where they had scored and cut. It leaves like a rough edge that kind of bubbles, and so I pull that off and get rid of it. Now I'm grabbing the colored tubing out of the kiln. I had just the end of it tucked into the kiln to preheat. And this is Dark Phoenix from Greasy Glass. And I dropped some stuff on the ground because I'm the trash man. I'm taking the clear rod to build up more clear tubing on the end of the colored tubing. Because when I connect my blow tube and I condense all that down, I'm going to taper it, and building up some clear tubing on the end of that leads to less waste. So I'm just going around and around the edge and essentially coil potting more tubing to work with. Now I can grab that blow tube that I prepped and weld up to the clear section of tubing I've created. And I've got to melt in all those layers of coil pot and make a nice clean weld to my blow tube. So I heat them both, then I press them together, and then I focus the heat where the clear and the color come together, because that colored tubing is so thick that it needs the most heat, and the radiant heat will melt the clear coils as well as the blow tube. Then I'm going to taper it. I've condensed it down, and then I pull it out at this angle for that nice taper. And I can use that taper as the mouth end of a pipe or the top section of a vessel. It's much more usable shape where I can cut off there more easily to end a piece than I could in the middle of a wide, thick tube. And you can see here how where I've worked that glass, it's changed color. The dark phoenix is really fun like that. It changes color in the heat of the flame and in the heat of the kiln. Now I'm using my clear rod again to rip open the end of the tube. I'm heating it up and then pulling the glass away from that same spot, heating the same spot over and over and ripping away the glass that's there until it gets thinner and thinner and a hole opens up. Now I can weld up my other blow tube, and I don't need the coil potted clear tubing because it's already been tapered from when I cut down this tube in a previous session. But that hole and the flare on my blow tube are nearly the same, and again I direct the heat into the tube because it's thicker. And then the radiant heat will flow into the clear tube and melt them together. And here's me trying to decide what size piece I'm going to cut. How big do I want my vessel? How many vessels do I want to make out of this piece? And now I'm flame cutting this colored tubing. I put away the section I don't need back into the kiln and pick up that rod I dropped on the floor. Luckily, it didn't break, so that's a huge bonus. This is grease stain from Greasy Glass, and I'm going to layer it over the dark phoenix because the dark phoenix gets very dark. It becomes like almost black, of a reddish, purplish, beautiful color, but it gets very dark. So this is the first time I've layered grease stain over it. This is my first time using grease stain pretty much at all. I tested a couple of pendants with it, and I got a lot of like yellows and oranges out of it, a little bit of kind of a hint of blue. So I'm going to layer it over the dark phoenix and hope to get a brighter, pinker color. And I'm just laying down one stripe after another, melting it together, trying to push out any air bubbles between any of the layers of glass. Now I melt all those lines in to create an even walled piece of tubing again. I'm going to start by melting in the ends. That's usually where it's more uneven and bumpy. And I want to get that nice taper that I can work with. If you're interested in getting into glassblowing, you can start practicing by holding your arms out in front of you. Just holding them out there for several minutes at a time. I'm going to pull this tube out. I've condensed it down so that I can stretch it out into a longer, narrower tube that's not necessarily thinner, because I've added that layer of glass to make it thicker, and then condensed it down, meaning closed up the inside area, not all the way, but made it more narrow, and then stretched it out longer. So the glass is still pretty thick, but I've changed the overall diameter of the tube. This is closer to the size of tubing I want to be working to make these mini vessels. The next step is to round out the end of that tubing where more glass has collected and condensed, just to create a more even-walled tube to start with. I can start rounding it out. Working towards that vessel shape. But before I actually blow my bubble, I want to go in and make the neck of the vessel, the top. I like to shape that part out first and then blow my bubble so it all flows together beautifully. And again, I'm condensing it before I stretch it out. If you just get it hot and yank on it, it's going to get very thin. But you can see how it's like pinched right there. So I'm narrowing as I'm stretching so that I don't end up with like a paper thin film that's just going to crackle and shatter. Now I can condense the tubing down and back. I'm melting it, and I'm using the force of the flame as well as gravity to push it all together so that I can then blow it out. Condensing before I blow it out so that my bubble isn't thin and papery either. That way my bubble stays nice and thick. Durable. And I end up with a bit of a nipple at the end because there was more glass there. So I end up condensing and blowing out this bubble a few times until I feel like the wall thickness is really even. I don't want a big chunk of glass at the bottom. I don't want one side of the bubble to be thicker than the other. So I just keep condensing it, squishing it all together, letting the glass flow around and around and around to even out, then blow it out again to get a nice even-walled bubble. Glassblowing teaches us to be ambidextrous. I take turns turning the glass with each arm so I'm not wrecking my shoulder, so I'm not wrecking my wrist. And you've seen as many times as I am turning the same piece with both hands as well, so your hands have to be able to work together and work independently. And I noticed it's not a big piece of glass. It's only, the colored chunk is probably, 7 or 8 ounces. So at most half a pound. But it's on the end of this long, narrow tube. And that torque creates more pressure on my joints. So it is physically demanding, especially for someone like me who has hypermobile EDS. My joints are very loose and very fragile. Now I've heated up the top of my bubble, and now I'm allowing it to slump to get that like mushroom shape. This is one of my favorite shapes of vessels. And then I heat up the bottom of it, and I'm using the marver to taper it even more dramatically. So it's less bubble shaped and more of a cone shape. Now I'm going to polish out any marks from the marver and let gravity pull that cone shape just a tiny bit more. Then I go back to the neck and I hit it with some extra oxygen just to see if I can make a different color there. While I'm working on it, I don't know how these layers of color are going to react in the kiln. With some striking colors, you can get levels to it, kind of. If you hit different areas with more or less oxygen or a hotter flame, you can get like bands of color even after it goes through the kiln cycle. I don't really end up with those bands at the end, but I tried. After the kiln cycle, it all pretty much evened out, but I did end up with the lighter pinker color that I was going for, rather than a super dark reddish purple. I flattened the bottom of my vessel, and now I'm going in with some grabbers to take my vessel off of the rest of the tube. First I'm going to pop a hole, and then I'm going to rip it the rest of the way off. I prefer to do it this way. You can just flame tear, but you risk enclosing that hollow form, which can cause it to explode. And you can, there's a technique where you can kind of heat up the vessel, and then it'll push that force through the hot part where you cut. But on something this tiny, that's really hard to do without overheating my grabbers. So with the little tiny vessels like this, it's easier just to pop that hole, so I open up that tube and then to tear from there. And then I can use my clear rod to clean up that opening, try to make that the lip of the hole as even as possible. And again, I use that graphite flare tool to flare out the opening and create that pretty little lip at the top of the vessel. After this, I make a opal topper that can sit on that lip, and it just looks so beautiful. I'm using a graphite paddle to flatten it out and make it level. I use the flaring tool again to make sure that hole is nice and round. I don't want any wonky egg shapes. When I make my topper, I want it to slide in and fit perfectly. And it's not perfect, but it's so pretty. Look at that pink red. I love it. Thank you for watching.